I want to start by saying that I know how this is going to sound, but I've been sitting on it long enough that the not saying it has started to feel worse than the alternative. So here it is. I moved to Cray's Landing in early October, which, if you know anything about the Washington coast, you already know was a mistake in terms of weather. A friend of mine had described the town as quiet and cheap, which were the only two things I needed to hear at that particular point in my life. I'd come out of a bad couple of years, the kind that leave you wanting to be somewhere nobody knows your name. And Cray's Landing fit that description just fine. Population just under 900. One diner, one gas station, one bar that doubled as a bait shop. The nearest city was 40 minutes east on a road that wound through so much old-growth forest you could go 10 minutes without seeing the sky. I rented a small house on Vella Street, one of those old craftsman-style places with a covered porch and wood floors that creaked in the cold. My neighbor to the left was a woman named Dessa. She was maybe 60, with short gray hair and the kind of easy warmth that made you feel like you'd known her for years within the first 10 minutes. She brought me a plate of food my first night there and told me not to worry about the rain. "You'll get used to it," she said. "I grew up in Michigan," I told her. "I've seen rain." She smiled at that, but it was a small smile, patient, like I'd said something charming, but slightly off base. I didn't think much of it at the time. The rain started that first week and didn't really stop. I'd known going in that the Pacific Northwest was wet, but knowing a thing and living inside it are different experiences entirely. In Cray's Landing, the rain wasn't just frequent. It was constant, in a way that felt almost architectural, like the grey sky was a ceiling and the water coming down was just what happened when you were indoors. I bought good boots. I bought a decent rain jacket. I told myself, like I'd told Dessa, that I'd get used to it. What I noticed first was that nobody else in town seemed to mind it at all. Not in the way you'd expect from people who'd simply adapted. They didn't hurry between their cars and their doors. They didn't hunch their shoulders or keep their heads down. They walked through the rain like it was pleasant weather, like it was the kind of thing you'd want to be out in. I saw a man eating lunch on a bench outside the diner during a downpour. I saw kids playing in a yard without coats on, while their mother stood at the edge of the property with her face turned up toward the sky, eyes closed, completely still. I figured it was a local thing. Every small town has its own particular weirdness, its own set of habits that look strange from the outside and make complete sense once you've been there long enough. I filed it away and focused on settling in. The dreams started around the third week. They weren't nightmares exactly. There was nothing chasing me, nothing screaming. I'd find myself underwater, deep enough that the light from above was just a faint grey smear, and I'd be completely still, not drowning, just suspended there. And somewhere below me, in the dark where the water became something else entirely, something was there. I couldn't see it. I couldn't even really perceive it the way you perceive a shape or a form. It was more like pressure, like awareness turned outward in your direction, like being watched by something so large that you were less than a speck to it, but it was watching you anyway. And that attention, that faint and enormous interest, was somehow the most terrifying thing I had ever felt. I'd wake up with the sound of rain on the roof and the smell of it coming through the window, and it would take me a while to shake the feeling that the dream was still happening. That same week, I noticed the thing about the rain's smell. I know that sounds like a small detail, but stay with me. Rain has a smell. Everyone knows that. Petrichor, they call it. That clean, earthy scent when water hits dry ground. The rain in Cray's Landing didn't smell like that. It smelled organic in a different way, something deeper and older, a little like the ocean, but not quite. When it had been raining for a while, and you'd been outside in it, the smell got into your skin and stayed there. I noticed it on myself after a few days. I noticed it on everyone in town. It wasn't unpleasant. That was the thing I kept coming back to. It wasn't unpleasant at all. It was around that time I started finding myself on the porch without meaning to. I'd be reading or watching something on my laptop, and then I'd become aware that I was outside, standing on the covered porch with rain coming down a few inches from my face, looking out at the street, not distressed, not alarmed, just standing there. I couldn't tell you exactly how I'd gotten up and walked out there because I didn't remember deciding to do it. I'd come back to myself after a few minutes and go inside and try to figure out what had just happened, and I couldn't. I mentioned it to Dessa one afternoon when she came by with some extra firewood she said she didn't need. She listened to me describe it with that same patient, quiet expression she'd had the night I told her I'd get used to the rain. She didn't seem alarmed either, which I remember bothered me. "Has that happened to you?" I asked. "All my life," she said. "You stop fighting it, it gets easier." I should have asked more questions right then. I didn't. The missing persons thing came up at the diner a few days later. I was having coffee, talking with the woman behind the counter, a younger woman named Petra with a sleeve of tattoos and a dry sense of humor. Somehow we got onto the topic of long-term residents, people who'd been there for generations. And she mentioned, in the same tone she used to mention everything, that the town lost people pretty regularly to the water. Not accidents, not drownings in the usual sense, just people who walked into the ocean during bad storms and didn't come back. "How often?" I asked. She thought about it. "Couple times a year, more in a bad storm season." "And no one does anything about it?" She looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity. "What would you do about it?" I didn't have an answer. I thought about calling someone, the county, a journalist, someone, but I kept getting stuck on the fact that the people in town didn't seem traumatized by it. They talked about it the way you'd talk about a natural thing. Sad, maybe, but natural. Like how people who live near wildfire country talk about losing houses. It's terrible, but it's also just what happens here. I started paying more attention to people's behavior during rain after that. What I'd written off as local charm started to look different under a second reading. The stillness I had noticed in people standing outside, the faces turned upward, the total lack of hurry or discomfort. They weren't ignoring the rain. They were receiving it. There's no better word for it than that. They stood in it like it was something they needed, and their faces had that expression you see on people in moments of deep private relief. I started sleeping with the window closed. The dreams kept coming anyway. The thing in the water was closer in them, or I was closer to it. The pressure of its attention was heavier. I could almost make out a shape in the darkness below me, something vast and slow-moving, something that had been in that particular piece of deep water for so long that the ocean had shaped itself around it, the way a river shapes itself around a stone. I'd wake up gasping, and then immediately be aware of how hard it was raining outside. And then I'd notice I was already at the window, already looking out. I went to Dessa's house one evening and asked her directly. I told her what I'd been experiencing: the sleepwalking to the porch, the dreams, the smell of the rain on my skin, the pull I'd started to feel when storms came in, a low and wordless pull in the direction of the water. I laid all of it out, and I asked her what was happening to me. She was quiet for a long time. Then she poured us both tea and sat down across from me and told me what she knew. She said there was something in the deep water off the coast. She didn't know what to call it, and neither had her mother or her mother's mother. It had been there as far as anyone in Cray's Landing could trace the knowledge back, since before the town existed, since before anyone had put a name to that particular stretch of coastline. The rain came from it, the way heat comes from a fire or mist comes off a river in the morning, a natural output, part of what it did just by existing. She said the rain had something in it, not a chemical or a toxin. She was careful to say that. Not anything you'd find in a lab, something else. And every time it rained, that something landed on the skin and soaked in just a little. It worked slowly in people who'd grown up there. Years and years of small accumulations. But in someone new, someone who hadn't built up the slow tolerance that came from a lifetime of light exposure, it worked faster. The dreams were part of it. The sleepwalking was part of it. The pull was the last part. She said the thing beneath the water didn't hunt. It wasn't cruel or angry or even really aware of individual people the way you or I would be aware of an ant. It was simply doing what it had always done, reaching. The rain was its reach. And when it had reached a person enough times, when enough of it was inside them, the person felt the pull. Not as a compulsion exactly, more like a homecoming, like suddenly knowing where you'd always been supposed to go. She told me she'd felt the pull for years. She said she was almost ready. And the way she said it, I understood that she meant she was almost ready to walk into the water. She said it the way you'd describe finishing a long book or getting to the end of a project you'd worked on for a long time, tired and relieved and at peace with it. I left her house and lay in bed for a long time, listening to the rain and not sleeping. The storm that came in 3 nights later was the worst I'd seen since moving there. I could hear it before I was fully awake. The sound of it on the roof was enormous, a constant roar that made the walls feel thin. The wind was pulling at the eaves. My whole house was shaking in a low and steady way, and the pull was stronger than anything I had words for. It wasn't a thought. It wasn't a decision. It was more like gravity, that same mindless insistence that makes things fall, and it was pointed directly at the water. I got out of bed. I put on my jacket and my boots, and I stepped outside. The rain hit my face, and it was warm. In November, on the Washington coast, the rain was warm, and I stood in it for a moment, and I understood in some distant part of my mind that it should have terrified me, and it didn't. It felt like something I recognized. Dessa was already outside. So was every other person on Vela Street. There were people coming out of every house up and down the block, moving in the same direction, not hurrying, just walking with that same settled, purposeful pace you use when you know exactly where you're going. Nobody was talking. The rain was loud enough that I'm not sure we could have heard each other anyway. I walked with them. I walked for several minutes, down through the neighborhoods toward the road that led to the shore, and the pull was with every step, pulling and steady as a current, and the rain was in my hair and on my face and soaking through my jacket, and it felt like being submerged, and it felt like coming home, and I kept walking until I didn't. I still can't explain exactly what happened in that moment. There wasn't a thought or a voice or any dramatic internal struggle. I just stopped, like a thread had reached its full length. I stood there in the rain, in the middle of the road, and I watched the people of Cray's Landing walk past me and keep going. Dessa passed me without looking. She was soaked through, her grey hair flat against her head, and she had the most peaceful expression I had ever seen on a human face. I watched her go. I watched all of them go. I stood there for a long time in the roaring rain until the last of them had rounded the bend toward the shore, and then I was alone. None of them came back. When I drove past the beach the next morning, it was empty. No clothing left behind, no shoes at the waterline. Nothing. Just grey water and grey sky and the rain, still falling, always falling. I packed a bag and left Cray's Landing before noon. I drove east, through the forest, through the mountains, away from the coast. I told myself I just needed distance. I told myself that whatever had been accumulating in me would clear out once I was somewhere dry. I live in the interior now, nowhere near the water. I don't walk to the coast on weekends, don't even particularly want to. By most measures, I'm fine, but it rains here too. Not the way it rained there, not that constant breathing grey, just ordinary weather, ordinary rain. And sometimes, on the nights when a storm comes through and the rain hits the roof loud enough to fill the room, I'll come back to myself standing at the window with no memory of getting up. The smell of it is on my hands. That deep organic smell, old and dark and faintly salt-tinged. The smell that has nothing to do with petrichor and everything to do with something that lives in water deeper than light has ever reached. I haven't sleepwalked outside yet. I haven't felt the pull since I left. But it worked on Dessa her whole life, and she said it worked slowly. And I think about that a lot. I think about the math of it, the patience of it, a thing that has existed in that deep water long enough to change the climate of an entire coastline doesn't think in weeks or months or even years. It thinks in the long, dark time that passes in the ocean depths, where nothing hurries, where everything eventually arrives. I tell myself I got out in time. Most days I believe it. Most days it isn't raining.